Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Danielle Morse, and I'm the grant coordinator for the South Tahoe Public Utility District. Welcome, and thank you for taking time to join the district as well as the Lake Valley Fire Protection District for this public workshop on updating our multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. Your participation in this workshop is essential as we assess the natural hazards that can both affect our community and identify actions to reduce risk to critical assets and essential systems that support public health and safety. Updating our hazard mitigation plan helps ensure that we proactively plan to protect these investments in reducing the likelihood and the cost of service disruption and strengthening overall community resilience. Mitigation actions can also help avoid large, unplanned repair costs that can put upward pressure on customer rates. Maintaining a current FEMA-approved mitigation plan also helps keep our districts eligible for state and federal hazard mitigation and disaster funding, which can support future projects and reduce risk before disasters occur. And it also ultimately helps keep costs affordable for our community. So again, thank you all for being here this evening, and we appreciate your time and your input in this process. Before we dive into all things mitigation related, just a few housekeeping items. If you have not already, please do sign in at the podium at the front. Up there, you can also find a copy of our agenda for the evening, as well as comment cards, which we will discuss a little bit later in the presentation. Restrooms can be found out in the lobbyway area right out there. And then there are refreshments available here for anyone that is interested. And then lastly, if I could ask if you could please silence your cell phones, we would greatly appreciate that. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our presenter for the evening, Juliana Prosperi. Juliana is an environmental scientist and serves as Vice President and Director of Environmental Planning at WSP. WSP is leading the update of our multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Juliana.
Thanks, Danielle. Well, I guess I'll start with there's a safety hazard. Hopefully I do not trip on that. I'm usually supposed to give little updates on that at my company since we want to minimize safety, and here we're talking about safety in a sense. So tonight's meeting, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Juliana Prosperi. I'm with WSP. As Danielle already mentioned, I've been with our company 12 years now. I've been living in South Lake Tahoe in the county for I think over 20 years now. So that's about how long, a little longer than that, I've done hazard mitigation planning, environmental planning on all different types of projects in the Tahoe Basin over that time period for different agencies like the city, both the county, TRPA. So it's a pleasure to be able to get to work with South Tahoe Public Utility District on this type of plan. My team specializes in hazard mitigation planning and wildfire planning, so it's very relevant given some of the hazards we'll talk about today and some of the hazards this community has experienced in the past. So the agenda for this evening is shown here. We're going to talk really just a little bit about what the process looks like and what the county, the district, including Lake Valley Fire Protection District and South Tahoe Public Utility District, have embarked on over the last few months in terms of developing a plan update for their district. I'll go through a preliminary review, so sort of a higher level review of all the different hazards we've profiled so far in this plan, as well as a little snapshot of the risk assessment of the plan itself. Briefly talk about capabilities. We'll talk about what goes into a mitigation strategy. I'll talk about how the plan will be organized once it's circulated for public review, so something you all can read and review. And then we'll talk about, lastly, how to provide feedback on the plan, so how you can provide comments, feedback, and there's going to be a couple different opportunities that have passed already, but some that are still available in the future once that draft plan is out for review. And then we'll wrap up with some questions and answers at the end. So my objective is just so you all walk away tonight, you kind of know what hazard mitigation is, why the planning process is important, Why we update these plans every 5 years, because that is pretty frequent when you think about it. And that really makes them active plans, and it's a pretty important component, and that sort of differentiates these types of plans from longer-term range plans, like a general plan, you know, the county or the city might do for their community. It's more sort of a longer-term blueprint of how things get developed over time. And then I'll talk about the critical facilities and assets that we looked at in this plan, and then we'll talk about how to provide input in that next schedule. Danielle sort of gave a good explanation of housekeeping. I'm going to try to keep this part of the presentation to 45 minutes. We've got a lot of slides and good stuff in here. We just did a bunch of analysis, but I don't want to bore you with all that, so we'll try to get through that. There's also what we call a polling tool called Slido. That's called slido.com, and if you go to your phone and just put in slido.com in your web browser, we also have QR codes you can take pictures of. But you basically can go to that website, put hashtag STPUD HMP, and it will bring up 3 polls questions that we have. And here's sort of an example of what it looks like. Okay, I want to start by saying there is a pretty awesome core planning team that's been working on this project behind the scenes over the last 3 or 4 months now. At STPUD. In addition to Danielle, there's Megan Cobley and Jennifer Marshall on the left here. And we also have from Lake Valley Fire Protection District, where did you go? Martin's in the back corner there on the left. All working on this plan. It's going to result in basically plans for both of the districts that address their hazards and come up with a suite of mitigation actions for their districts. And then these are just the folks on my team, in addition to myself, that help with the writing, the research, the spatial analysis, the modeling, and just helping us assemble and put together the final plan. So why do we do these plans? There's a lot of different reasons or different trends that have resulted in increased costs over time that really have an impact on communities in terms of how much it costs to respond and also ultimately recover from different events, from the winter storm events we have to more tragically and more impactful the wildfires that happen in this community. There's also more people and just things like assets and critical facilities and especially homes that are now in defined risk areas. So these are really like a wildland-urban interface or a floodplain, you know, where in the past we may have not had structures or facilities in those types of places because there's just more people, there's more things. You know, we've had population growth. We also see a lot of different types of hazard events now over time. They've been increasing exponentially over the last decade, especially wildfires in California. In addition to that, we also see and experience different types of hazards. An example there would be like the pandemic and other types of interesting public health hazards that have happened as well. So again, these all also result in additional disaster declarations. So there's different levels of declarations. Depending on the severity of a hazard event, you can have a federal disaster declaration, you can have an emergency or a state emergency proclamation, and then local proclamations that can be documented or proclaimed locally here at the City of South Lake Tahoe, the district, as well as the county. So those are some of the reasons why we develop these plans. You know, in addition to acknowledging that they are a requirement to get hazard mitigation funding dollars, they're also just a smart planning tool to do in your community. So there's good ethical and legal responsibilities. I think I've covered the importance of how these escalating costs associated with disaster response and recovery have continued to increase. And so this part of a lot of the studies that FEMA has put out there have really good statistics on the cost-benefit analysis of doing hazard mitigation. So what they find is for every dollar that you invest in hazard mitigation during this process, you know, will result in up to $6 or more, depending on the hazards, in recovery or response costs you could have spent on not doing anything. So they do result in, you know, reduced costs in the long term. So there is a high benefit to doing these types of plans and actually coming up with the mitigation projects themselves, because those are what they're actually measuring to come up with that cost-benefit ratio. We know many of the events, particularly in this community, for example, every year we have major severe winter storm events, right? We have power outages. We have the threat of wildfires every wildfire season. Our wildfire season is getting longer each fire season, and it can happen any time of the year, as we saw with the LA fires in January of last year. So these events are predictable, they're repetitive, we know there's ways to reduce and minimize the hazards associated with them. And then these plans are just a nice cost-effective way, as I mentioned, to outlay or lay out all the different types of mitigation projects that you can do in your community over a sort of a short-term 5 to a long-term 10-year type time frame. And then there's funds to be able to help you do this. So hazard mitigation is part of the 4 phases of the emergency management cycle. So here you can kind of see all those. You have response, recovery, which would happen right after disaster occurs. But the other ring of the circle of emergency management is also mitigation and preparedness. So the distinction with hazard mitigation here is any long-term sustained action that you would take in your community or at the district to reduce or eliminate those types of impacts from the hazard events to life, people, property, and in this case, the water district, wastewater district's assets. How are they conveying and delivering water or wastewater services throughout the community? So good examples of this may be relocating some facilities outside of a hazard area. We have large, marshes, floodplains in Tahoe. We know there's homes, facilities near or in those zones, and some of the mitigation options may be relocating them or elevating them. Those are examples of hazard mitigation. We're also in a very seismically active area. All of California really is, so any type of seismic retrofit type project is another example. And then finally, any type of creation and maintenance of defensible space, structure hardening. Those are all examples of hazard mitigation that are applicable and make sense in a wildfire-prone community. So Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. This is really just the federal legislation that is driving the need for these plans. You actually don't have to do a hazard mitigation plan, but if you want to be eligible for funding after a disaster, if you do one of these plans, you would be eligible for pre- and post-disaster mitigation funding. The requirement in the statute is that these plans are updated every 5 years, as I mentioned, so you are eligible for that funding when it becomes available. And when we do these, we follow all the federal emergency management guidance documents. I have some of them on the front here if you're really interested in looking at those. A lot of this policy actually had a significant update in 2023, so there's been some new requirements since the district last did their plan several years ago. When we do the planning process, we do go through a 4-phase or 9-step process to update the plan. Right now, we're sort of finishing up step 2, which is assess the 2 districts' hazard risks. Step 1 involved organizing the planning process. So this is really bringing together the core planning team, our community stakeholders. We form what we call a hazard mitigation planning committee, and so that's just trying to make sure we have representation from not only the core STPUD staff, Lake Valley Fire Protection District staff, but other voices of agency, organizations, stakeholders in the community that know a thing or two about hazard mitigation already come to the table and kind of share well, what are they doing? How can we collaborate on projects? How can we partner? So those voices are heard, because I think when there's more meaningful coordination, it just really builds and results in better mitigation projects where you actually have possibly larger projects that kind of go beyond community boundaries and different district lines and service areas and benefit the community and have a greater capacity of also getting implemented over time. So that's all step 1. Step 2 is when we assess risk, and I'll get more into this. Step 3 is where we actually develop projects and actions and policies or programs that make up what we call the mitigation strategy. This is sort of the heart of the plan that most folks find interesting in terms of what are you actually doing? What is this plan going to actually result in? And then step 4 is where we adopt the plan. This is also where we make sure that over time, every 5 years, but also in between those 5 years, you're actually updating and implementing this plan. You're coming up with maintenance schedules, who's responsible for this project, so forth and so on. So it's the phase of the planning process where we're trying to make sure that the plan stays relevant, current, and not just something you're dusting off on your shelf and looking at every 5 years. So it's more of a dynamic plan and planning process. I talked a little bit about staying organized. This was just some of the key things. The only thing I hadn't really mentioned is this map is showing the different service areas of both South Tahoe Public Utility District and the lighter pink, and then outside of that is Lake Valley Fire Protection District. So two similar but not the same planning area boundaries. So that's essentially those two districts' service areas, and where the STPUD provides water and wastewater service, and Lake Valley Fire Protection Services. I will point out too that in some of the maps, as some of you know, South Tahoe Public Utility District has their recycled water system that goes all the way up and over Luther Pass into Alpine County. So we did account for in our analysis of the facilities out in Alpine County, just to make sure that there's also mitigation projects for those assets as well. Building a planning team. This is just this is a small snapshot of all the other federal, state, and local agencies that either have been invited or have been actively involved so far in our first two meetings for this process. I don't know if I have it in a slide, but usually we have 3 or 4 hazard mitigation planning committee meetings throughout the planning process with this group. That makes up more of the agencies, organizations, and local governments representatives that are participating on that team throughout the process. I just didn't get them all to fit in here. So local government, we just have regional, and we have TRPA here, but we do have Chief Jim Drennan right behind you there from the city of South Lake Tahoe. So they have actually been participating, and I know that they participate. South Tahoe Public Utility District participated on their plan too a few years ago. And as part of the process too, we also work with neighboring jurisdictions. So like the draft out, we have to coordinate with Alpine County, Douglas County, Placer County. That's part of the process as well, and they're invited to be on the stakeholder committee group as well, but not always active participants. So as part of this, we are required by FEMA to also not only engage stakeholders, but also the general public. So that's why we're all here this evening and why this is such an essential part of the process, to make sure that you're both informed about and learn about hazard mitigation planning, but you also have an opportunity to comment on the plan, to provide your insight, your feedback. So as part of that, usually there's an outreach strategy. In this case, it can be as simple as like a calendar of what types of outreach tools you want to use and when those are going to occur within your planning process. So one of the first tools is we developed an updated web page, which you can go to there, that's shown on the screen. We just finished the circulation of, I think it was open for 2 months-ish over the holidays, a bilingual public survey, so it was in English and Spanish. Really just a lot of questions asking the community, like what are the hazards you think are the most important here in South Lake Tahoe? What types of mitigation, projects do you think would be important in your community? We have a little bit of summary on the results of that at the end. We usually do a workshop, press releases. There's lots of social media posts. And then once the plan's available, we'll have a draft you can actually look at online and provide feedback with an online comment form. That's just an example of the flyer. So, oh man, this isn't actually working because I messed up. Okay. Well, I'll just ask you guys. Sorry, I didn't link it to Slido. But the question was, how did you find out about the meeting? And the answers were, did you find out through the flyer? Did you find out through the social media post? Did you find out through the web page? Did you find out through Jennifer or Danielle's email blast? Or did you find out from some other way that we didn't say? Or maybe Shelley did some announcement on the radio and I didn't hear that. But the newspaper, okay, nice. Well, that's just something helpful to know because sometimes we don't always do the newspaper anymore. We'll just rely on like social media, but it doesn't always get everyone. Yeah, like a legal notice. Okay, so the next part of this presentation, I'm going to do a little overview on what actually goes into a risk assessment. So there's 2 parts of the risk assessment that goes into a hazard mitigation plan. There's lots of different risk assessments, different types of plans and long-term plans. And other types of plans we do for water districts and cities, but this one in particular will first describe all the types of hazards that may occur within a community. So this is really, you know, what can happen in South Lake Tahoe? Has it happened before? When it has happened, how bad has it been? And these are types of the information you would find in the hazard profile that makes up the first part of the risk assessment. The second part is where we do a vulnerability assessment on specific assets that make up, you know, that community. So those may be the people or water customers within a community or planning area. They may be property within a county. We usually look at like parcel level data or building structure data to understand, well, how many properties, how many structures could be impacted by a wildfire event. And then we also look at infrastructure. In this case, this plan will be very heavy on looking at specific critical water and wastewater infrastructure associated with the district's assets, as well as the fire stations within this community. Then we do what we actually call the vulnerability assessment, where we actually kind of do an overlay analysis, and we look at, here are the hazards, here are all the assets, wherever they intersect is where we like to assume that, okay, there's probably a risk of exposure here to those different hazards. If we don't have nice maps of hazards, because not all hazards are created equal in the types of data we have to look at this, we'll look at other data. So for example, like drought impact reports, we may look at those quantitatively, qualitatively to better understand like what exactly are the potential exposures, and then also what, based on that exposure, what of the assets are actually susceptible to risk. This is all summarized in what we call the risk assessment. Last but not least, and I'll talk about this a little more on another slide, is the community capability. So that's really what can maybe minimize that overall risk and overlap. Because if you already have another program or plan or an actual project that minimizes that risk, that's not been taken into account in some kind of GIS model, you know, that's where the community capabilities come in. And it's very, very important because it would actually be one of the tools that's already in place that minimizes risk for a district or a city or a county. This is just another snapshot of all the different information that gets summarized in the report. I realize this is just my screen. So the hazard problem definition is just really describing what that hazard is. Each of the sections also describes how much of that hazard covers the project area or the planning area. Extent, severity, magnitude is capturing really, if this hazard event were to happen, how bad is the damage going to be? How bad is that event going to impact the community? Based on the duration, the onset, the type of hazard event it is. So it comes in with like dollar values. It could also just be like if you have a major flood, like it's going to be like the velocity, the flow, you know, of the flood within that waterway in that particular area. You know, how bad it could be. You know, and then also the damage associated with like a wildfire, for example. Previous occurrences are just obviously a list, as it sounds like, all of your past hazard events. And we have a lot of databases that we can document this, and some are more accurate than others. And then climate change considerations. As of 2023, we're now required to have a whole section on climate change and how it can increase or exacerbate the severity of the different hazards we look at in these plans. And then the vulnerability assessment. So this is kind of its own section, and I mentioned those are all the different assets we look at. The two that I didn't talk about yet is economy and natural and cultural resources. We are required to also look at, you know, if these hazards were to happen, you know, how is it impacting your watershed health? That's going to impact water supply, water quality, for example. So it may also impact the natural resource itself, but have a downstream impact on other things a water district cares about, for example, in terms of just good water quality and good water supply. And then lastly, we're required to address future and planned potential development, as well as growth projections in a 5-year time frame, because these plans are updated every 5 years, and then we summarize all this in a risk summary. So in this plan, we're looking at 13 priority hazards. I'm not going to go through them because I have a slide on each of these after this. This is pretty much in alignment with the hazards that were looked at in the City of South Lake Tahoe plan, as well as El Dorado County's Multi-Jurisdictional Hazard Mitigation Plan update. So avalanches, This is obviously this is a pretty unique one in South Lake Tahoe and in the city. I'll say I've worked on a lot of plans across California, Nevada, Colorado, Montana. But this one, you know, besides, I think we just did a plan for town of Breckenridge. This is actually a hazard that impacts the community. It actually impacted the water district just a couple of years ago in terms of destroying one of their electric generator buildings over by I guess that's the west side of Fawn Leaf Lake. So this is any sudden release of snow or the downstream movement of snow, not slow, in usually a steeper terrain. So most of the southern boundary and western boundary of the South Lake Tahoe community is prone to avalanches. If you look at avalanche maps from the county, they're a little outdated and just show all of this area as being in a zone that's prone to avalanches. Most of the triggers and impacts, obviously, we see are along roadways, you know, but it is important to recognize that obviously the water district's facilities have been, you know, exposed to these and impacted by these types of hazards. I will mention too, lastly, you know, all the avalanche recordings are not, this is not Monsieur Avalanche Center recordings. This is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Storm Event Database, and it doesn't really do a good job of capturing avalanches, just so you know. I always get questions on this. But there's obviously a likelihood of these occurring in any given year in South Lake Tahoe. We do look at dam incidents or dam failures as part of this analysis. So this is the probability of a structural failure of any type of earthen or man-made constructed dam facility. Usually there's really high consequences if any type of dam facility were to occur, but it's also a very low likelihood of that type of event happening in any community. A lot of this changed during the Oroville Dam incidents several years ago. So there's been a lot of uptick in the funding behind FEMA's High Hazard Potential Dam Program, or HHPD program. So as part of this, like, we'll make sure that there are mitigation projects that not only address district dam facilities, but also other dams that are upstream of the city and the planning area that could impact downstream water customers or communities. So this map's just showing all the different dams that kind of fell within, and then mostly they're outside of our planning area, but then if they were to breach or have an incident, could impact downstream assets. And some of these include a couple of the facilities down in Alpine County at Harvey Place and Indian Creek Reservoir. So drought and water shortage is a particular hazard of high concern for any water district in California and really anywhere across the West, especially when a community may rely on just one type of water source, being either surface water draws and deliveries or groundwater. In this case, either being dependent strictly on one or the other can make any kind of water district vulnerable to droughts. Dry spells, or just really drought is a period with, you know, no rain, no precipitation over a longer period of time. You can see in the graph, hard to see this, I can't even see this, but from 2000 to 2026, so almost 25 years, all the different dark is representing the longer term droughts that have happened in California. It's hard to see that 2012, 2016, that was the last major long-term drought in the state, and so obviously all water districts, including STPUD, were susceptible to that drought. This is the kind of information that we look at in these plans, likely to continue to occur more frequently over time. Lots of other plans also within a water district that already address drought and water supply challenges as part of just being a district that delivers water to the community. Extreme heat. Extreme heat's probably not a hazard that's of high priority. As you can see at the bottom, we kind of summarize the extent, the probability of future occurrences, the magnitude, and the overall significance. This was the only one, I think, that was low. We included it here because it was included in the county's plan, and the counties and cities are now required as part of their general plan safety element, which is a plan that's related to a hazard mitigation plan, to address extreme heat based on California state legislation. So it's in here. And it's also just to make sure these plans are kind of aligned with some of the other regional and local hazard mitigation plans. But as you can see, for this community, even the number of extreme heat days or warm nights, I should say, are going to increase through the middle of the century and the end of the century. And that's really what this graph on the left is showing. So that would be an impact to a community that doesn't have, for example, air conditioning. So it will get warmer. Landslides, this is any kind of downward movement of earth or rock that can be triggered by earthquakes, but also wildfires and any type of major rain events, severe weather. And so you can see there's a lot of moderate to high landslide susceptibility across the planning area. It's hard to see, but in particular, kind of on the western side, there's a lot of, the steep slope around Echo Pass. So all these areas are susceptible to landslides, as well as some of the major water linear assets that the district owns and operates that go up and over those passes, like Luther Pass. So they'd be susceptible, even though some of them are underground, to any type of landslide event. Those can be particularly also exacerbated during earthquake events, which is another hazard we're looking at in this plan. So on this figure, you can see not only the Alpha Criolla fault hazard zones, the major quaternary fault lines, epicenters. We've got a couple of them mapped out. Obviously, they correspond to the existing faults, but there is quite a few faults that run along the west shore of Lake Tahoe, as well as several that are out in Alpine County, right around the Nevada-California border. If you've been here the last 5 years, you've probably felt ground shaking before, because I have, and it's been pretty scary. So some of the planning area falls within these yellow-orange zones, and this is really just, we call it like a ground shaking probability map. So if there were to be an earthquake, this is like where they would have a high probability of ground shaking based on where you might be living or working within the South Lake Tahoe area. So overall, this has been ranked a medium significant hazard as it relates, again, specifically to the district's assets and risk. So flooding. Flooding is another major hazard, not only for the whole state of California, but the South Lake Tahoe community and this planning area. And this is really any area that is temporary covered, that's usually covered by land and dry, that may have water exceed the capacity of its channels, shorelines, drainage systems, and they actually get flooded. So it's the covering of land by water during those flood events. And some of those areas typically have water in them if they're sort of perennial streams or waterways. But in this case, flooding is going to include both what we call the 1% annual chance flood event of occurring in any given year. So that's what 100-year flood plain refers to, or the 0.02% annual chance of flood event occurring in that year. So that's kind of a less likely flood, but that can happen every 500 years, is kind of the terminology that we use. So within the district boundary, there's very many mapped flood zones that extend inland from Lake Tahoe, that follow a lot of our waterways, such as the Upper Truckee River, Trout Creek, Cold Creek, Heavenly Creek, that kind of all flow into South Lake Tahoe, as shown on this map. As part of our analysis, we kind of look at all the assets that could be within or outside of those floodplains. If I click through this, you can kind of see we've also looked at stream environment zones. This is a term specific to Tahoe that's really just mapping out the areas based on the land capability system in the basin that also consist of, wet, riparian, wetland-like, marsh-like drainages that have, areas that are also susceptible to flooding. And so that's kind of what's shown on this map. This is kind of hard to see too, but we also then, believe it or not, Alpine County doesn't have FEMA mapped floodplains, but the state of California Department of Water Resources use what they call best available maps, and those are maps here in red that show some of those flood zones down in Alpine County. So these are called like DWR, best available awareness maps of those floodplains. So again, we use all this information to see, where there are areas or assets or fire stations at risk to these different types of hazards. A SAISH is kind of like a tsunami. This is any standing wave that oscillates in an enclosed or semi-enclosed water body like Lake Tahoe that can, after some type of force, start and end and create that wave. And so usually these are caused by earthquakes or ground shaking related to an earthquake event. They can also happen, you know, in steep parts of the lake where you just have a huge rockfall or landslide. You've probably also seen a lot of wave action just during a really severe winter snowstorm. There's been actually a lot of modeling that's been part of the City of South Lake Tahoe Hazard Mitigation Plan, where they've actually looked at SAISHs and research done at University of Nevada, Reno, or UNR on the potential for SAISHs to occur in Lake Tahoe. And based on those analyses, like there are actual inundation areas that have been mapped that are, you know, could impact the South Shore if they were to occur. So because of that, this is discussed and evaluated in this plan as well. And then severe weather, this is really going to include all thunderstorm, hail, lightning types of events. These are usually the types of events that result in our, in addition to winter storms and high wind events, just the public safety power shutoffs or power outages. So this is also all evaluated in the risk assessment. Really, this is all kind of just a data set of, you know, overall precipitation throughout the year, averages, the highs, as well as some of the snowfall levels that we see in the spring and winter time compared to the summertime. Again, lots of information goes into the risk assessment. Sometimes these sections be quite long and lengthy, and a lot of it's just because we have to and we're required to follow like these prescriptive requirements to meet FEMA's expectations in these plans. So with that in mind, we try to keep them as readable and concise as possible, but sometimes that's a challenge. Soil hazards are also evaluated here, as well as land subsidence. This is sort of a medium low if you're looking at erosion and subsidence. Land subsidence really is more just like the gradual sinking or some settling of the ground surface. This is really common in Central Valley, California, where there's been a lot of groundwater extraction over time. You can also, there's actually incidents of it in Calaveras County, parts of El Dorado County where you have underground mine activity. So pretty much a lower risk in South Lake Tahoe and STPUD and Lake Valley planning area. Tornadoes are also unlikely, but we obviously all know we have very high wind events, and obviously these can lead to some of the unfortunately catastrophic wildfire events that we've had. And believe it or not, too, as shown on here, there could be a lot of damage associated with wind events over time, and we've noted some of those estimates of damage in the report and in the slide here. I won't go into tornadoes too much since we don't think there's been one recorded in the west slope of El Dorado County, but not up here. And winter weather is probably our most common hazard. We typically have heavy snow. There's high probability and likelihood of winter weather happening every season, and you know, this is another hazard that results in outages, power outages, and can affect the delivery of water and wastewater services within the community. So this is a high overall significant hazard in this plan, and there's also been damage to district facilities I've mentioned with the avalanche, as well as other facilities within their service area. And last but not least, wildfire. This is probably the other high priority hazard for not only both districts, but all of California. You know, impacts in the past have occurred here during Caldor, as well as the Tamarack fire, which was mostly in Alpine County. Again, most of the water district's utilities are out there, and you can see, you know, this is just the map of the state responsibility area and then the local responsibility area. And so the SRA and LRA is really just corresponding to the local jurisdiction service area boundaries, so the City of South Lake Tahoe area kind of delineated, but it's hard to see in that like green, very close part to the lake area, and then the rest of the SRA area is mapped out beyond that. And so this is just showing the fire hazard severity zone. So you can just see most of all of our community is very high or high fire hazard severity zone. And all of our communities also within the wildland-urban interface. And so many different types of impacts can occur to water, wastewater facilities due to wildfires, from degraded air quality, health hazard impacts, of the major ones being to water supply, and also severe economic disruptions associated, as we know, with Caldor, the evacuations, and then the repairs and service disruptions associated with systems going down, and taking that time to get additional backup water supply and wastewater services online. So this, taken together, this is what we put into a hazard or summary matrix that illustrates or shows the significance of all of those hazards taken together based on the extent, the probability of future occurrences, and then that magnitude, how bad it. If it does happen, what is that ranking? I didn't talk about this, but we have, ways we describe, if it's just a limited area, if it's significant, if it's extensive, that's really how much it's covering the project area. The probability of occurrences, we go from likely occasional to highly likely. Sorry, I forgot unlikely, and that's just, again, based on the number of events in the past, and you just take the number of events you've had in the past over a certain time period, and that, if you divide the two, you get the probability of future occurrence. And so that gives you a percentage, and we kind of figure out where that percentage fits within the probability of future occurrence scale. We assign it like a likely or a highly likely. So it's somewhat quantitative, but in the end, we really want to get everyone's input from both the public, our stakeholder groups, and the core planning team on like the overall significance of these hazards. So since this isn't working, not that it's not working, I just didn't set it up, but for those in the room, what are the top 3 priority hazards from your perspective? You have a question? Yeah, good question. So to meet the FEMA requirements, the district or a city, they actually only have to address natural hazards. You can address technological, man-made, public health type hazards. So it wasn't in this particular scope because the district, for example, has other plans. They have to meet requirements under the American Water Infrastructure Act to do a risk and resilience assessment, sort of just like this. And that actually looks at technological and man-made, so like civil unrest, cyber threats, are examples that are technological that are addressed in those other plans, but this is just focused on the natural hazards. And we did that on purpose to just focus the scope of this particular plan in relation to FEMA's review. And they're just like, they're not going to review those hazards when they go through their review. They're just going to look at the natural occurring hazards. This is just another little overview of what goes into the vulnerability assessment specifically. Again, we're looking at the value of the structures, the number of customers in the district service area, but again, very specifically, it's going to look at the inventory of the district's facility. So this is what that inventory looks like. It's a very robust, complex, detailed inventory of assets. I can say, if you look here, there's 16,528 distinct, different assets within the South Tahoe Public Utility District. Not to discount Lake Valley, but we only had 3 for Lake Valley Fire Protection District. Again, this just comes down to like your GIS data availability and what your facilities actually are. And so this is really detailed because it included like all the district's water, wastewater lines and valves and manholes and all the access points and control valves. So all the little stuff was included just because all that makes up what is their whole system. So to break it down a little more broadly though, the district organizes their system into 4 discrete systems. The X4 system that's conveying wastewater out of the basin, up and over Luther Pass into Alpine County, and then out in Alpine County there's the recycled water system and those facilities. The sewer system in the community, and then the water system in the community that's delivering our drinking water. And those two, each of these systems has linear or pipeline type of components, as well as discrete point facilities of particular assets that may be along that water or wastewater line, or they may just be separated out, pump station or water tank. Even the district offices are part of, and the wastewater, any kind of treatment facilities are part of this infrastructure count. So a lot of information. I'm just going to do a pretty high level, just an overview of what that looked like when we did the analysis. Not to get too into the weeds here, but this is all going to be organized by hazard in the plan itself. But this is just showing, like, okay, linearly for flood, you have 28 miles of line that does fall within the 100-year or 1% annual chance floodplain. 141 miles within the stream environment zones of that total on the previous slide. So that's just 14% of the total. And then of the point facilities, 340 of the 15,000 or so are in floodplain. And so okay, so the takeaway is, yes, there is going to be assets within the district that are at risk or exposed to some of these hazards. And this is what that looks like for dam failure. So this is obviously just where we have mapped inundation area. If a dam were to fail and all that water were to spill out from that dam facility or spillway, there's 68 facilities that could be exposed to that flooding related to the dam break or incident. So that's just 0.4% of all the district's assets. And then lastly, landslide here, before I go into wildfire. There's also a lot of different, just because of the landslide susceptibility across the planning area, a lot of different assets at risk. And then we have done a lot of analysis on wildfire risk, many different plans now across South Lake Tahoe, El Dorado County, the city of Placerville. I mean, it's like, you all kind of know everything's at risk, but there are areas that are going to be more prone to wildfire risk than others based on their location, based on the vegetation type, based on potential critical flame length possibilities in certain areas based on vegetation and so on. So this is just showing, you know, basically the number of, or miles of linear features within the district's water assets that are exposed to the moderate, high, and very high fire hazard severity zones. I should note these were all just recently updated in the last year and a half within the city of South Lake Tahoe and El Dorado County. So it's all pretty recent wildfire risk data. It's hard to see this one too, but this is just on the left, the district's water system assets. Again, given the level of number of lines and the level of detail, it's hard to see, but there's a lot of different assets. And then the sewer system, the recycled water system, and the export system. So if you have you're interested in maps, there's going to be a lot of maps in the risk assessment on all this information. As I mentioned, it gets a little more basic. I actually don't really know if the Golden Bear Station, is that really in a floodplain, Martin? Because I didn't think that was, but I live over there. I mean, there's the drainage across the street, but anyways. Okay, well that says that the station's in the floodplain, and I'll check on that one. But I questioned that before I saw this. But we've seen it before. We've seen community centers and fire stations out in Sonoma County in floodplains, so it's not surprising really. But again, these are just, you know, how those facilities are or are not in some of those mapped hazard areas. Again, this is just for those hazards where we have the GIS spatial data available. So then we mapped the flood ones and the fire hazard severity zones in relation to the district's fire stations. If anyone wants to answer this question, this is really just if you have any examples of how these hazards have impacted you. It can just be as a resident, have they impacted you, how it's impacted if you've been in a wildfire or a severe winter snowstorm. Have you lost service? Have you lost power? If anyone wants to share, you want to share something?
fortunate not to get rain on us. What it's like without.
Definitely want to buildings that collapse during the winter.
I know that we decided in our family it was a little more traumatic going through the following winter following the wildfire, because the wildfire we evacuated, and then the next year was the snowstorms, and we had a leaking roof, and that wasn't fun. So those are the impacts. You know, in terms of the water district, it's also impacted their facilities, and following some of the wildfires, you know, one of the biggest impacts I don't think, you know, I knew much about were all the impacts to their recycled water systems and open ditches and conveyance systems out in Alpine County, you know, following the Tamarack fire, and then some of the post-wildfire land instability and erosion issues. So these are also areas where we want to know what the hazard impacts were, you know, to the community on the water customer side, but also, you know, again, specifically to the assets and facilities themselves. In the beginning, I talked briefly about the community capabilities. So this is just where we inventory all the different plans, programs, and maybe policies if you're at a city or a county that a community may already have in place that addresses or reduces hazards or may affect the vulnerability of those hazards. So an example from the district side of things would be their capital improvement program, and these are typically updated every 5 years as part of a strategic plan on a water district. There's also water districts do different types of water management plans. In this case, they also have an integrated regional water management plan. Some districts, depending on the size, they have an urban water management plan or a drought contingency plan or a drought resiliency plan. So all those different types of plans are other examples that complement a hazard mitigation plan in terms of the different short-term to mid-term to long-term types of projects that they have in them. And these can range from infrastructure projects to programmatic, you know, water demand type of studies to just better understand, you know, changing water conditions over time. And so again, these are all examples of ways to enhance capabilities that actually minimize or eliminate those types of risks over time to those communities or these districts. We try to understand this just to kind of help us understand where there might be gaps or areas for improvement to consider for new mitigation projects as part of your planning effort. And then in the beginning, I talked a little bit about the mitigation strategy. This is where we include the goals, objectives, and all those different projects. And so as part of this process, at our last meeting, we had to revisit all of these very broad goals that we have to come up with when we do these plans. I sometimes feel like this is the hardest part of these plans, is come up with these goal statements. But it's an important part of the plan because it kind of sets the organization of the plan, really, like on what the district's trying to do in terms of increasing the resiliency of their systems, hardening their systems, creating more redundancies in their systems, all to minimize disruptions in the delivery of their water and conveyance of wastewater in the community. So from the goals, we then, at our last meeting, which we haven't had yet, we start to actually come up with an update of the mitigation projects themselves. So we look at all the projects that were done in the last plan, and we get updates on those before we go into that meeting from the different departments. You don't have to do them all. We just try to see what the status updates are. Have they been completed? Are they ongoing? You know, are they deleted because they don't make sense anymore, or change of, you know, decision makers? And then helps set the stage for what kind of new projects we want to put into this project. And again, these can range from all different types of projects. They can also be projects that are lifted out of the district's strategic plan or capital improvement plan or other plans. And so those plans are sort of integrated and aligned with each other. When we look at mitigation actions, we also look at different buckets of the types of projects you might put into a mitigation strategy. So on the right, plans and regulations might be the plans themselves or policies or zoning code updates or ordinances that may apply more to like a city or a county. But a capital improvement plan update would go in there. For a water district, a structure and infrastructure projects are probably going to be your biggest bucket of project types that they would consider in their hazard mitigation plan, like things they want to do to actually improve the resiliency or the hardening of the facilities out in Alpine County, but also within the South Lake Tahoe community. Maybe certain facilities need to be rerouted, for example, changed, relocated, or just like I said, hardened. Education and awareness is an actual other project type. So just after this planning process is over, the district can also get funding to continue to keep their water customers informed about hazard mitigation, and then just also giving them updates, you know, on water conservation practices. Those are other fundable project types. The natural system protections would be like a watershed health improvement type project. We work with water districts that have watershed land and they're drawing surface water out of reservoirs. For example, out in Sonoma County, where, you know, they want these areas protected, so they want defensible space projects, and those actually would fall in the natural systems protection section, any kind of fuels treatment project in those areas to mitigate the impact of wildfires when they do occur would fall in that category. And if any other restoration, river restoration, wetland, stream, marsh restoration project would happen or be an example. All right, we're getting to the end. Plan implementation and maintenance. This is just keeping the plan current. As part of this process, the state has to review the plan for 45 days, and then the FEMA has to review the plan for 45 days. So they take up a lot of the planning process in their review. It's quite fun, but this is why the plans actually are quite detailed. But once those review periods happen, we can actually then bring the plan to the board here for final adoption and consideration, and the plan can be finalized. So based on that, I'll just say there's a couple drafts that we go through, an admin draft that gets reviewed by our stakeholders, the Hazard Mitigation Planning Committee, that's HMPC, the public, the state, FEMA. So there's lots of drafts that get circulated as part of this process, and this is just a layout of how the plan will look or how it's organized. When I say base plan, that's going to be South Tahoe Public Utility District's plan, and then the Lake Valley Fire Protection District is going to be an addendum to their plan. So that's just going to have their specific planning area, their specific hazards to those fire stations, and then their specific mitigation projects. So it might be a little more fire-centric than the water district side of things, but that would make sense. Pretty quick here, but this was an online survey that we circulated for about 2 months. There were 88 responses on it. There will be a full report that we'll be including in the plan, but these are just sort of a snapshot of some of the questions we asked the community on, you know, how many times has the hazard impacted you? You know, we got an example from one of you on that. You know, how concerned are you about climate change? And then also, you know, how concerned are you about your water or wastewater being disrupted or turned off or impacted by a natural disaster? So you can kind of see we get somewhat concerned on that last question there. About half the folks were very concerned about climate change, which is good. And then how many times, you know, 41% of the community has been impacted at least 1 to 2 times by a hazard event. So obviously that was with the winter storm events and some of the wildfires in the last few years. And then we also just had everyone rank the hazards themselves. So let's see, so low is the red and blue is actually going to be the high. So the higher ones are winter storm, wildfire, severe weather, like all other types of weather events besides snowstorms, and then I guess we have high wind in there too. Flood a little bit, not as high. And drought pretty high. All right, so if you have feedback or comments this evening, you can check back. If you want to just wait and provide comments at a later time on the plan itself, check back. There'll be an email blast or there'll probably be a newspaper notice or some type of social media notice that that plan is available for public review, but you can basically find that at the district's hazard mitigation plan webpage, which is up here on the screen. We're also asking folks if you have actual feedback or questions or comments to email or call the district's customer service department and put, you know, let them know what your comment is by email and writing or over the phone by calling this number here. You can also, we have comment cards, just like the good old days, and so you can put your comment, I don't have it, but there's half-page comment cards in the back of the room if you want to write your comment and put it back at the front entrance of the room when you're leaving. Or you can actually just ask me if you have any questions. So this was the only public workshop that we had scheduled as part of this planning process. So if you have any questions, I do encourage you to ask me or Danielle or Megan or Jennifer, but if it's on hazard mitigation, I'd love to answer it. But moving forward on schedule stuff, we're hoping to, we're internally reviewing that risk assessment I talked about today within our team to release in the next week here to the district for review. That's the biggest chapter we go through first, so all the analysis I went through today, and then hoping to get the group together again next month to talk about new mitigation projects with the district and Lake Valley Fire Protection District. And then we're hoping to get in May that public review draft out for review. So that's when that would be posted for you to actually look at, the Bible of hazard mitigation as it relates to the district and fire district. And then we'll end with those 2 review periods this summer and this fall by the state and Federal Emergency Management Agency, and hopefully adoption by the end of the year. Any questions? Okay. So we actually do address them. We usually make sure, like a lot of the stuff on like the hazards, we ask like what hazards do you think we should address, so we don't leave any out and have to sort of put them in at the very end, so that's all consistent in alignment with like what the public perceives as the most important hazards. Sometimes we'll get all sorts of questions, comments on the analysis, but more so like the projects. People really seem to get interested in like, well, what exactly are you doing? And have you considered this? And if you haven't considered this, where would this type of project, get addressed? And if it's not in the water district project, sometimes I'll say, well, go check the city's plan or go look at the county's plan. Usually some of those other types of projects that community members might be interested in are just in a different agency's plan. Those are, so good question. The big part of the old plan, besides all the technical data, like on everything I kind of presented tonight was a little heavy on the risk assessment. We carry all that forward into this plan as well, like all past documents of hazard events and how they impacted the district. But the one part that's pretty obvious that will get carried forward into the plan update are actually the mitigation projects from the last plan. Yeah, because a lot of them are actually ongoing. So there's ones that have been completed, but a pretty common category are ones that are just, they're ongoing. FEMA doesn't like to count the annual maintenance type of project as like a project, but they're in there for a reason because they continue to relate to hazard mitigation. An example may be like ongoing defensible space program implementation in and around like a district facility, right? You're always going to do that. That's good maintenance, vegetation management. And so those continue to stay in there. They just might get reworded or changed, but we'll note that they were part of a rollover from the previous plan. I'm trying to think of other examples, but that's the main one. It's the mitigation strategy. Do you have a question?
Yeah, is there currently a joint plan then of the fire district and sewer district or what?
So both districts were previously part of the El Dorado County Multi-Jurisdictional Hazard Mitigation Plan update. Eventually they want to be part of that plan update in a future plan update cycle. But right now, because their plan is expiring, they need to have their plan stay active so they can remain eligible, because they are actually and have been actively using FEMA dollars for both recovery from past wildfires and just for pre-mitigation funding projects. So this is like a plan specific to the 2 districts for the next 5 years. There is. Yes. No.
virus.
Yeah.
So, so it's really, kind of just sort of working around the edge a little bit.
Yeah, there's also new requirements we have to update. So like I mentioned, like extreme heat got added, and obviously all the different hazards change, and so the information and the mapping and the data, like specific to. Okay, well I'm just saying, like sometimes we'll add new hazards, the maps and all the data gets updated, like all the data of the maps, that's pretty regularly updated, especially in the state of California. Which is a good thing, to have current data. That's something like we have that's very accurate. But a lot of the ways we describe the vulnerabilities, changes too from year to year. And it's become the need to be more specific because they're really they want to make sure that the projects that they fund make sense and, have a benefit to cost ratio. And that's also part of the project process is like when you design the project, those benefits must outweigh those costs in order to get funding. So there's a lot that goes into the design.
And some of our districts were done back in 2020 timeframe, and FEMA came out with new regulations in 2023 that changed some of the requirements for what goes into these plans.
Mm-hmm.
That's another big kind of update we've got to do with this new
Yep. Behind, no, theirs is current. They got theirs updated 2 years ago, and the city just a year before that. So there's different reasons too, like sometimes all of a county will do one whole big plan together. You might see in other counties, sometimes some water districts in particular, in cities will just have their own plan. And sometimes it's because their planning areas may vary quite a bit. In this case, they do, I will say. Tahoe Basin is unique, and it's a lot different types of hazards, even though we're looking at the same hazards. The way they impact the community here is different than down on the West Slope. So.
And this is a much more in-depth analysis of our plan area and what we do.
That's another true thing. Like the assets and all the inventory, that's special service. They don't have as many facilities. Yeah, the water district data gets pretty complex, One day I'll be an expert on it, but we'll see. I want to be.
To your point earlier, in terms of this being more of just, it is an update, but I know for me, one of the things that I'm most excited about with this is that it does give us a chance to redefine our mitigation strategy based on projects that we've already implemented. We are very fortunate that the district has been very successful in receiving mitigation funding through FEMA. We've primarily used that to implement backup power solutions to keep our infrastructure operating in times of emergency. But, now it's time to look deeper. What more can we do? What other projects do we want to propose that really will help meet all of those objectives that Juliana was describing?
Yeah, I would echo the same views on the mitigation plan. We'll see some changes there because, for example, home hardening is being emphasized now more than ever. That being a mitigation change or an effort or a push on that education side.
Any other questions? Well, if you have questions, my contact information is here, and I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions on the plan, the process, mitigation ideas, projects. If you do curious about mitigation projects too, there's a couple examples up here in the front after, if you want to just come and ask me a question after, there's all different types of examples from other water districts, communities, counties, tribes, that we actually go through in detail, like when we kind of brainstorm about mitigation projects with communities when they do these updates. But if that's it, the presentation part of this is over, and I guess I'm going to pass it to you, Megan? Okay.
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming tonight. For those of you that just show up, we do have lots of food over here. Please
take a bite with you before you leave, but this is an important step in the FEMA process, is to do the public workshops, get the public outreach. We did record this, I'm pretty sure, hopefully that worked, but we will provide copies of this presentation to anyone if you would like a copy, so just make sure that you have signed up. There's an email slot on there, we can share it. Go to the website, there's opportunities for you to participate on the website. And yeah, we're really excited to keep this moving forward. Martin, would you like to say anything?
Just the same thing, like our expedition, we want to thank you for your participation. It's an important part financially for us to want opportunities there and really great mitigation strategy. Great work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're excited to partner with Lake Valley on that. So. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Feel free to look at copies.
And please do fill out comment cards. We would love to hear your comments.